Hello, ngHouston. So tonight we have a great show and I'm pretty excited. I twisted Ed's arm to get him to come on and talk about GraphQL. So it's going to be really great. But first I want to introduce the panel. First we have Bill Odom, one of the awesome instructors over at Angular Bootcamp. Bill, you want to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Bill Odom, like Bonnie said, with Angular Bootcamp. Also do a lot of freelance development and consulting and generally just wandering around doing stuff.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
And we have Denny, one of our ngHouston organizers. How are you doing tonight, Denny?
I'm doing great. So I'm a member of ngHouston here. I'm helping to organize lately and working for a company called Servient. We do e-discovery software, and I do the user interfaces for that here in Houston. And just an Angular enthusiast, thanks to Bonnie. So happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Okay, and Sean. Sean, you've been on the panel a couple times. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me. My name's Sean Neckelman, and I'm currently a software developer over at NASA.
Well, awesome. Welcome.
Thanks.
And last but not least, Ed Pelc. And I met Ed at NG Atlanta, and it turns out we know some of the same people and we have some of the same friends. And he's just the coolest guy. So I twisted his arm. We were talking about GraphQL, and he kind of got into it and started poking around and liked it. So we actually had, because I was talking to Sean and Denny both recently about GraphQL. So I twisted Ed's arm and said, come and teach us, because I'm sure there are more people out there who are interested but haven't really quite. GraphQL is kind of hard to pick up. So, and by the way, Bill, have you done GraphQL before?
Yes, I have. And
so you know, so are you like an expert, a GraphQL expert?
No. But I know
maybe after tonight.
I know where to find them.
Okay, without further ado, Ed, you want to say hello? Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
This is the first time you've ever been on ngHouston at all, right?
Yeah, my first time talking, first time ngHouston.
Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I hope you come back and join us again.
You
have slides for us? You want to tell us about, well, you have an intro slide, right?
Yeah, I have an intro slide. So
you want to share your screen?
Share my screen. Can you guys see it all right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so this is my intro to GraphQL and Angular Apollo talk. Let's begin. So my name is Ed Pelc. I'm the CEO of a company called FreightCheck. Our aim is to solve your logistics and shipping issues. You can kind of think of us as the Expedia for freight. I've been working on a pretty cool side project too lately, which lets us process wood slabs, and I got to use computer vision to automatically detect and crop slabs in the pictures. It was pretty fun. I'm finishing up some integrations with shopping carts and inventory systems for that. That's me in the upper left there. And our first slab that we processed a few weeks ago was slab shot to the right of me. And then at the bottom, you got a little bit of how FreightCheck looks, which is what I work on in the day-to-day. I've been working with Angular for about 3 to 4 years now. I started out with AngularJS. Done a couple of projects in Angular 5 lately. Just about finished upgrading FreightCheck to Angular 5. So why should you listen to me talk about GraphQL? What experience do I have with it? Like you, I heard a lot of good things about GraphQL, and it seemed like it would solve a lot of my issues. I didn't actually get to try it out until recently. Basically, I've been wanting to use it for a while, but I just didn't have the time to get everything set up. It kind of seemed a little new and risky to me. Seems to be how a lot of people I met felt about GraphQL up until recently. Anyways, I met Bonnie a couple months ago at NG Atlanta. She encouraged me to try it out, and she got me set up with one of her talks that she did with Sam a little while ago, and sent me over some demo code, and off I was. So I had this kind of distributed job system that several of my apps were using internally, which I really needed an admin interface for. We were just starting to use it more and more, and we had some errors with some of our jobs that were talking to external services, and it was just kind of hard to debug them. So it's kind of a small to medium-sized project, and I decided to jump in and build it with Angular and GraphQL. And here I am to show you what I learned, and hopefully it'll save you a little bit of time with your GraphQL adventures. A little overview of what this talk will cover. My aim is to get you up to speed with the basics of GraphQL and everything you need to create your first production GraphQL server with Angular and Apollo. If I do my job right, you should walk away from this talk, get an idea of what GraphQL is and what you can do with it, core concepts that make up GraphQL and how they relate to current concepts that you might have already know with your REST APIs. We'll then go into details about how to actually use GraphQL in an Angular app by learning about Apollo, an excellent GraphQL library for both your client and server needs. After that, we'll find out how to explore your API using developer tools like GraphQL. This will make your life a lot easier. And finally, we'll cover what steps you need to take as part of securing your server. You're going to be putting this out into production in a public setting, or if you just want to have a secure server internally. So, what is GraphQL? They say it's query language for your API. To me, that sounds a little vague and marketing. GraphQL, for all intents and purposes, is a replacement for your REST or SOAP APIs. One of its main ideas is having the client specifically ask for the fields that it needs. This gives many benefits, such as reducing your network load by not having to send all this data that you're not using. It also makes upgrading easier because you can just add new fields onto your old ones without disrupting any of your older clients. GraphQL is backed by Facebook. Hopefully you won't delete it before you write it. At the bottom of the screen here, we have a little bit of what the GraphQL flow looks like. On the left, we have some data that might be stored in a database on your server or in memory or something. You can see there's my name, Ed, my age, I'm 21. The client would send a query to the server with asking for the name field. We're going to display it maybe up in a toolbar. We might not need the age, so we're just going to ask for the name. You can see in our result, we just get the field that we requested. This saves on data, makes upgrading easy, like I said before. That's kind of the general flow of a GraphQL request. So one common idiom that you might have heard about GraphQL is that it can present a common API for all backend services. It's kind of a big selling point. What this means is that you're going to be wrapping potentially old or legacy APIs in a new GraphQL server so that a modern client or web app can easily access all of your data in one place. Basically, you're going to be putting in a little bit of work on your back end to make your life on the front end much easier by providing a single way to retrieve your data.
I like this because it lets you use the, when I learned RxJS, I was really excited about it. And all these observables that were flying around and real-time updates, and it was easy to do coming out of Firebase. But I couldn't figure out how to do it out of my old, on-prem SQL database. Like, I couldn't figure out how to make those. And I know now with like sockets and stuff like that, but this really made it a lot easier to implement that observables, those cool RxJS functionality that I wanted.
Yeah, it gets you pretty close to Firebase-like functionality too.
Mm-hmm.
Once you're set up with them. So to begin, I'm going to explain some of the core concepts that you need to know about GraphQL so that we can get you off on a good start. We'll start with the basic data types that GraphQL supports. They should look pretty familiar to you if you have any programming experience. They include basic numbers, floats, booleans, strings, and also a special ID type. The ID type is the same as a string, but it is used anywhere that you'd want a unique identifier. Basically, if you got an object with a number or some other type of identifier on it, you would use an ID instead of using a number or a string. It's more just to make reading your API documentation easier and to keep things a little more consistent. One thing you should note though with ID type is that it's always serialized as a string for transport. So do not expect to get a number back if you send a number to your backend. You'll get a string on your backend code. Sort of fact that might trip you up, so be careful with that. Next, there are also some more complex data types. There will be enums, which allow you to define things like saying north, south, east, and west, or correspond to numbers 0, 1, and 3. We have a list, which are basically your arrays and any other programming language. There are interfaces, which allow you to specify types that must be included, in order to implement an interface and satisfy it. We also have unions, which are similar to interfaces, but instead of defining individual field names, you're saying that it's a union of several different types or objects. You can do cool things like mark types or arguments as required. There's also options for setting default values in many cases. And then one issue that I ran into with the type system in GraphQL is that it doesn't support arbitrary like dynamic map support. For example, you cannot have arbitrary field names on your object. You either have to serialize these objects as a string and decode them on your client, or you can convert them to an array of key value objects instead and send them down that way. This is a minor issue, but it's something to keep in mind when you're designing your API or when you're thinking about how your client might communicate with the GraphQL wrapper for your API. Queries. So you want to get some data out of your fancy new GraphQL server. You do that, you start by writing a query. Think of it as a GET request if you're coming from the REST world. With GraphQL, you get to specify exactly which fields you need on the client, similar to how you query a database, except that your GraphQL server is your database and only allows you to ask for specific fields. Every field that can be returned by a GraphQL server has a resolver associated with it. A resolver is a function that returns the data for a field. It can return a simple scalar value, like a string or a number, or it can return a complex object. To get a field is to resolve it in GraphQL lingo. The best part about having a resolver function for every field or object is that you can pull that data from any source. It can come from in-memory if you're just testing something, or at small scale, SQL server, MongoDB, etc. This makes it very easy to create a GraphQL server which provides a new modern API for several of your older or internal services. Kind of tie them all together in one. This is what a query looks like in GraphQL. You start with the query keyword and then the name. You can then specify any variables that you might need along with their types. After that, you specify the names of methods within your query that you can call. You can use any of your variable names as arguments to these methods. The important part is that you only have to list the field names that you need for your application. Right here, we have a repo name variable, which is a string, and we are using in the getRepo method as the argument for the repo full name parameter. Then we are going to request just the ID and name of our repo, even if there are potentially many other fields on a repo object. This might seem a little verbose to start out with, but remember that Apollo gives you a lot of helpers to take queries and combine them together so you don't have to repeat yourself quite as much. Next up, we have mutations. Mutations let you create and update and change your data. You can think of them like a post or delete request if you're writing a REST API. The syntax kind of looks like a function call. You pass in variables and choose what fields are returned, just like in a query. Basically, it looks like a query syntax because it is query syntax. You're just changing the query keyword to mutation. Right here, we are creating a repo for our new GitHub GraphQL API. I'm passing in a repo name, using it in my create repo method, and asking for just the ID and name in return. Our last core concept is a subscription. Subscription allows the server to send continual updates to your data. You think of queries as promises on the front end, and that they only give you one response. Subscriptions would be thought of as observables, and that they give you many responses over time. Subscriptions look exactly like queries again in your GraphQL schema, except that you're changing the query word for subscription this time. Subscriptions are best for when you need to small send updates in near real time. You typically use a regular query to get your initial data and would update the small parts of that data that change often with a subscription. Now, onto the hard parts of subscriptions. You might have just swapped out a query keyword with subscription to start. The subscriptions start to require a lot more work when you have multiple users or servers, and you want it all to just sync like Google Docs. If you have only one user, or basically sending updates to everyone, then your life is easy. You don't need anything. You don't need anything fancy to do this. You send out updates to all of your GraphQL clients via a single global reference on your server. It's pretty easy to do. When you start to add an account system to your app or need to have user-specific views, then you just made yourself a job. Depending on the details, you might have just earned yourself very good job security because you will be here for a while. And how do you deal with this? Setting up a publish-subscribe system will allow you to route data changes on your server to individual GraphQL subscribers. A publish-subscribe system will allow each GraphQL connection to subscribe to your topics they're interested in, just like how your client is subscribing to your GraphQL server. With a single server, you can simply use in-memory pub/sub event system. This looks just like how your front-end event handlers in JavaScript work. You have different GraphQL connections subscribe to things they care about changes for, and they will receive update events, which can then trigger sending out GraphQL subscription updates to your clients. When you start to get into having multiple servers, this can get a little bit more complex, since you now need to send update events to different servers too, and maybe route within the different accounts on each server. One easy way to deal with this initially is to just swap out your in-memory pub/sub event system with a central server like Redis. This will route all update events to your Redis server, which will then deal with sending the update events to each individual server or process that's interested in a given channel or type of update. This will make it just work for a long while. There are even packages available for Apollo to easily hook your server up to Redis with just a few lines of code. Improvements after this include using custom peer-to-peer protocols to send change events directly to servers which are interested in them. Instead of sending data to a central server, the benefits of this are that you no longer have a single point of failure with your Redis server, and updates can be sent quicker because they go directly to the servers that are interested in them. Apollo and Angular. So let's use GraphQL on our Angular project. How do I use GraphQL with Angular, you might ask? The best answer is to just use Apollo for everything. Apollo is a great client and server library, which also integrates nicely with Angular. It's very performant and also well maintained. It provides methods for hooking with GraphQL queries and hooking incoming requests up to resolver functions on your back end. It also gives you a lot of helpers on the front end to deal with various GraphQL things. Other options that you might have heard about include Relay. However, newer versions of Relay are starting to copy core concepts within Apollo. So it's best just to start with Apollo if you're creating a new project and don't have to deal with any legacy. So defining Apollo queries. You define queries in Angular Apollo using the GQL template tag in JavaScript or TypeScript. This tag allows Apollo to parse the queries. Besides this, Apollo queries look exactly like any other GraphQL query. Also note here that you'll want to use the template string literal syntax, which is a backtick, instead of any other like single quote or double quote. So how to query? There are two main options when it comes to Apollo. The first and simplest option is to use Apollo.query. This submits the query to your server and returns an observable with a single result. You should start out with this, and if you need more advanced options, you'll want to look to watch query. It takes the same options as a query call, but it returns an observable and provides updated values from the Apollo store over time. The Apollo store is a client-side cache maintained by Apollo. This is a little bit of the magic part of Apollo that it gives you a lot of bang for your buck for. The cache is updated whenever you make another query. and say that there's an object in that query that you queried in a watch query, it would send a new value on that watch query observable with the local updated query result, so that you don't need to make multiple server calls to get the same data out. Yeah. So using Apollo.query is so this is how you use Apollo.query. You pass in a query field, which just has your GQL tagged query string. And then you can optionally pass in some variables, which will go into your query. And you can see here that I'm passing in my name, which is Ed, and that's taking in the $name variable, which is a type string. And it takes that $name and is passing it into the list messages method call as the name parameter. Now, you could change $name to $foo or whatever you want to call it. The important part here is that list messages has an argument called name, which is, so this name argument is hard-coded. That comes from your backend GraphQL schema, while this $name is completely defined on your front end, and you can arbitrarily change that to anything you want. And then again, you can see that we're just listing out the fields that we need for this specific instance in our app. And this returns a query observable, which you can subscribe to and get your data out, or if there's any errors, you can also read those here. So this data is boring. Let's change it or mutate it. Mutations are very similar to Apollo.query. You pass in a mutation and some variables and receive an observable with the result or an error. Apollo also supports something called optimistic UI, which is more of an advanced concept. It's normally very hard to implement. Basically what this is you send your query up to the server, but you don't want to display any loading bars because your server is just going to send back essentially the same data plus maybe an ID field, which you're not going to show to the user. So you just want to close maybe your dialog or modal pop-up that you have with your form on it and instantly show this new value in maybe a list. That's what optimistic UI is. To do this with Apollo, you have to specify an optimistic response field, which you basically just have to redefine what the response is going to be by passing in your input variables again. It's kind of more an advanced option, but a basic mutation looks just like a query where you're changing the query field to a mutation. So now you know how to query and mutate your data. The next thing on your to-do list is probably add pagination somewhere so that you can page through all this new data that you're adding and listing in your app. If you started with pagination in Apollo, you need to store a reference to the result of one of your calls to an Apollo.query or watch query. The object returned from one of these calls is called a query ref. It has a special method on it called fetch more, which allows you to request more results with potentially different input variables, such as a different page number. The reason you want to use fetch more instead of calling Apollo.query again is that it will send new data to your original subscribers. This has the effect of automatically updating any list of items that are subscribed. And this makes pagination very easy because you don't need to change any of your plumbing. Essentially, you can tack on pagination as an afterthought to pretty much anything. Fetch more also has a couple of more advanced options on it that are kind of underdocumented, as Bonnie and I found out today. But first, it requires that you pass in an update query function. Don't believe the name on this one. This function really handles updating your query results and not the query itself. The example right here, you can see that most other simple implementations, this function can just return the fetch more result. How this works is previous can either be null or the previous result of that query ref. So say your list of items came back in this data, or your list of, in this example, we have a group chat. So you're making a WhatsApp clone. Say it returned the list of members in your chat and all of your current messages in that chat. On your initial query, this update query would not be filled out unless you called that query once. But the second time, that query would contain the last data that was sent on your group chat query observable, and then your fetch more result would contain your new data that just came from the server. What we're doing here is just always returning the fetch more result. In the simple case, this is what you want to do. But in more advanced cases, you have the option of passing in a second query variable here, where you can specify a more refined query. So in the initial query, we requested all the info about our group chat, and this more refined fetch more query, where we're just looking for the messages, we could define a new query that just has the message, maybe who it's from, and what the text in that message is. And then we're not, the benefits of this is that you're not listing out all that group metadata. And but when you do that, you have to update this update query method so that it knows to merge your fetch more result, which just contains your new messages, with your previous result, which has all of your group metadata and the original messages in it, so that when it sends a new value on your observable subscriptions, it has all of that metadata with the new value that just came from the server, because that server value is just going to contain your messages. That's a little more advanced option, but to start out with, I'd recommend just having your update query return your fetch more results. And then for your variables, you're just passing in like a page index or an offset and how big you want your pages to be, or maybe that's hard coded. But yeah.
This was the one that we were having a hard time with today. Do I have an echo or are you an echo?
No, you're good. Does that kind of explain it, going off what we were having issues with?
It does. What was the thing we were talking about this morning with the update query and the fetch more, like, because the update query is going to tell it to go back and get more, and I think I was a little bit confused, and we kind of talked through it and it made sense more. But the update query is like, I was thinking it was just going to listen for something to change, but in this situation, when you use it with the fetch more, it's actually going to get the next page of results when the user clicks on the next page, right?
Well, the naming on this is terrible. Really, what it should be named is like a transform result or merge result with previous result. It's not updating the actual query in any sense of the term. It's so that previous value is the data that previously came from your original query or your last fetch more call, and then the fetch more result is your new data that just came from the server. And in simple,
you've summoned ngJesus. This is what happens when you start talking about Apollo and GraphQL. So we have Uri Goldstein who just popped in, but he doesn't have audio.
Well, hopefully I summoned him into my head.
He's here. I'm gonna put him up for just a minute so we can see Uri. And Uri, we can't hear you, but you can wave. So Uri is one of the creators of the Apollo library for Angular. Are you going to try and jump out and jump back in again? Okay, he's going to try. He's going to try and reset one more time so that hopefully we can get audio so he can come in and say hello. But yeah, if you want to, we were talking about the update query.
Yes. Oh, here. Yeah, we'll wait for him.
I was going to see if we were able to get him with audio. No audio. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, so you said you didn't like the name of it, and all of a sudden Uri appeared. I was like, see, that's what happens when you criticize open source. Be like, excuse me.
It's more of a short name, is really what it should be. What was I calling it?
I got to give you a hard time.
It's more like update result, but that's really long. Nobody wants to type that.
Yeah.
But if you don't know that's really what it's doing, then it might be a little confusing. But in Uri's defense, I think this comes. My guess is that it comes from the underlying Apollo client library instead of the Angular library.
Yeah, there are some things. Honestly, the actual name of GraphQL confused me a lot because I thought it was like a kind of like charting or like a D3 type of thing because it was like graph. And so I was thinking of charts and graphs. And it wasn't that; it was more like a REST API thing.
Yeah, I don't know. It came from Facebook, so my guess is that they're thinking it was like they kind of think of their data like a big like social graph. So maybe in that they're querying their graph, but I don't know.
So I put the screen back on you if you want to. Uri's going to keep trying to join us, but this is really a good summary of the way that you're going through it. So you should go back to that, and I'll be quiet and leave you.
Okay. Do you get how the update query works? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the name was a little bit, because that's what I was confused about when we were talking about it this morning. I was a little bit confused as well about the name, because I was thinking, because I was using update query for something else, but it looks like update query goes with fetch more. So
yeah, it makes sense in that you can pass in you can override the query in fetch more so that it's more specific query. So say you have your WhatsApp group with all of your metadata in it. On your fetch more, you don't need to get that metadata again. Really, all you really want is your new messages. So you would pass in a smaller query for just your message values. And then what update query really does in that case is it handles merging your new messages data with all of that original metadata that you had.
Yeah.
So that you can combine it together and not have to request so much info from your server, which speeds things up, reduces network load, all sorts of benefits.
Uri got audio. That's awesome. Hello, Uri. Actually, so I'm glad you're here at this particular moment, because we were talking about, can I jump in with, and we can talk about this for a minute with Uri, because I'm interested to see what he has to say.
Yeah, I think
will you, okay, well, I was going to say put your camera back on, but I'm going to put you back on presenting so that so Uri can see this. So Uri, Ed and I were talking about this morning, about the fetch more and the update query. So especially with regards to pagination. So since we have you here, is it something you could talk about for a minute? Because I was kind of thrown for a loop with update query. I was like, well, update query is used when the data changes, but in this case, it's actually updating the page number. That's what I was missing, because the data is changing, but the query is changing because you're passing a new page number. Is that right?
Yeah, the idea of fetch more is that you add to the results. You don't change the results. Those are not new results. It's appending to the results.
That's where we were thrown off with the update query. So if you use fetch more, you need to have update query chained to it.
Yes. Yeah. Like in order to basically explain how to update the query. Yeah. Like how to update the story.
This fetch more.
But also oh yeah. Sorry. Continue.
I was just saying, fetch more is like specifically for pagination. And they just, like, because pagination is such a common thing, that this is just something that you wrote for them. Yeah, and maybe
maybe a different name would be better.
I told Ed, he said something about the name, because I was confused about the name of GraphQL in the first place, right? Because I thought it was like a graph, and it's the API, which is really cool. But I said you summoned ngJesus. Speaking of ngJesus, we might have people watching that don't know who you are. Would you introduce yourself real quick?
I don't want to interrupt Ed in the middle. Sorry I was late.
No, that's okay. Well, just tell us who you are, and because you're not really ngJesus, or I can introduce you because I know you. Uri is, what are you, the creator of Apollo, or one of the creators of Apollo? You're on the Apollo team.
No, I used to be on the Apollo team. I quit actually 5 months ago. Yes, and
so can we still blame things on you if we want to?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and I started kind of my own company, and with a lot of friends. Some of them also, like Camille is like the main maintainer today of Angular Apollo. And Dutan, who wrote the GraphQL codegen. And yeah, we also keep building open source stuff, and also help people, work with this and doing it the right way.
That's awesome. Well, we really appreciate you crushing our party. We're glad to have you here. And if you'll stick around, because I know, so we're going to jump back into Ed's presentation. He's just going through the basics of GraphQL for anyone who hasn't jumped into GraphQL yet, because we have a lot of people who are interested in thinking about it and just haven't actually spun it up yet. And then when we circle back around at the end, we'll have some questions and maybe you can help us out.
Also, Ed, no pressure
sorry
at all.
for-
It's not like Uri isn't one of the people in the world that knows the most about GraphQL of all
You
the
guys-
people on the planet.
Ed's going to kill me when this is over. He's going to see me at ngConf and he's going to strangle me. Don't kill me, Ed.
I wish I could show you my face right now. I'm so happy.
You can show me your face. You can show me your face. Okay, well, so yeah. So do you want to jump back into your? I'm sorry, we just totally threw you off, and yeah.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, I'm happy.
Hey, Ed, can I just ask a question? You know, it's probably something a little more remedial, but earlier in your slides, you said that GraphQL can provide pretty much like an aggregate of different data sources, SQL, Mongo, whatever databases, but is that further than just databases, or is it strictly, you know, direct to a database? Is there other sources like maybe another API that you could tap into?
Yeah, you could definitely wrap services or files or devices on a computer, anything you could think of.
One of the things that I like about it is, like, I think the first example that I really snapped to was like Netflix, how you have recommended movies, right? And in SQL, which is what I really learned with, in SQL, you would have to go and get, you know, you get your API, you get your lookup field, and then you might have to go to another table and look up, you know, some related information that it might not all be in the same table. And the problem is with that you have to do 2 round trips, and you have to go get this data, which includes a lookup key, and then use that lookup key to make another call to get the next section of data. And it just kind of wraps all that up. And even if you're going from different sources, GraphQL will just make it and bring it all back in one package. But I remember I went to Uri and I was like, Uri, why do we even need GraphQL if we still have to make all these round trips? Like, what is the point of that? How is that helping me at all or saving me? And he was like, because all of those, Bonnie, no, it's cool. Listen, he said, all of those round trips that you're doing are synchronous right there, right? So you're not, when you go across to the client, you have like one super succinct little bundle that goes to the client, and it's like super fast. You have only the fields that you want, and you can wrap up all those. You know, if you have multiple queries and you're going and getting all these complicated things in the server or in the you know, in the database or several databases, then you can do all that in the server and then bring your client this really nice, you know, succinct little package, and you have less.
Are you there?
And I was like, wow, that's genius. I take back everything I said about you, Uri.
You cut off at exactly the most important part.
Yeah.
Does that, sorry, Ed, I jumped in and answered Sean's question because I'm a nerd about GraphQL, and I was really excited about GraphQL. When I finally like put my head around it and understood how to use it, I was very excited.
You're good. I have a counterpoint though, not to just overly praise GraphQL, but you could do that with a REST API or even a SOAP API if you're using older stuff. It's just that the benefit of GraphQL is that you're just requesting the fields that you need, which is normally very hard to do in a REST API or a SOAP API because it's not built in there for you.
And I could see how this would be beneficial for somebody like a mobile developer who is really concerned about bandwidth over the wire. And I saw again earlier you were demonstrating the differences between like a put and post, and the differences between GraphQL. But so does the request still come with the same HTTP header as in, or is it always GET, or does it matter? Like if I'm
basically there's transports in GraphQL, and I think Apollo usually handles that, but at some point it goes to a transfer library or a transport library, which could be an HTTP call, and then that would define if it's going to use GET request, or I would assume it's probably using post request for everything, or it might use GET request for queries too, depending on some security stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense because of the body size, sure, yeah.
There's also WebSocket transports. With like your basic Apollo setup, it's doing JSON over HTTP, but you could probably switch that out to WebSockets easily. And actually, I know you could switch it to WebSockets easily, but you could even switch away from JSON to something that's more compact, like a message pack or something more efficient if you really do care about bandwidth issues on mobile. So you can really get the size. But basically, you can swap out the transport very easily to get your size down.
It's very soothing to have Uri going while you're talking. Like you have it. Like I want you to stay in the little corner of my screen all the time, Uri, all the time that I'm coding, and go. Except every once in a while, if I go off on the wrong path, Uri will go.
That seems like a VS Codes extension someone should write. Uri,
Yeah.
your editor.
Yeah, just doing that. It's funny because when we went, I don't know, Ed, if you watched that, when Sam and I did our GraphQL talk in Florida, and I had her wear the Uri wig and beard.
Yeah.
But she was on stage, and if you see her on stage, she was going like this. But I never told her that part. Like I was like, "How did you know that Uri does that?" And it was just the cutest thing. It was great. Like she just picked that up all by herself.
I'll just disappear now.
No, we love having you.
All right. Any more questions? Are you guys ready to continue?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay, all good. On to the next one. So I've added this slide because it's a very important rule. You should know how to find out more info about Angular Apollo when the docs aren't telling you what you need to know. A lot of the times the information is there, but some of the little details that you might need just to satisfy your interest for knowledge might not be there. Whereas you can get the job done, but you might not know exactly what your code's doing. Most of Angular Apollo, to my knowledge, is a wrapper around the underlying Angular client library. The Apollo client library. Sorry, the Apollo client has its API clearly documented in a much more reference style manual with methods, different call names, and parameters. So for example, I used this when I was trying to figure out what the difference between watch query was and query and when you should use the different ones. There's kind of a little bit more info on the Apollo client documentation for that. But anyways, if you go to this link, which I'll have a shortened link to these slides at the end so that you can get here, you can find the Apollo client docs. And yes, I do realize there's a React in that URL, but the important part here is the / reference takes you to the Apollo client docs. So next up, we got developer tools. GraphQL has several developer tools available out of the box, but my personal favorite and the one we're going to cover tonight is called GraphQL. It's going to be your new best friend when you're developing. So GraphQL comes with awesome developer tools to make your life easy. Nearly every backend server library provides built-in support for a tool called GraphQL, which is an in-browser IDE for exploring your API. How you use this is you just go to your /GraphQL endpoint in your browser, and then depending on the content type, request header, which changes when you open it in a browser versus using like a curl command with a JSON header, you automatically just get the graphical GUI client as a response. So now we have a demo time, and I'll show you a little bit about how to use GraphQL, since it might be a little hard to start. Let me switch my screen.
When I first found GraphQL, I loved it. And actually, when I first figured out how to use it, it was awesome. But the trouble that I had with GraphQL when I first started was I didn't know which parameters were available. So like I'm pulling this, get data, and then you put in like first name, last name, and I couldn't figure out because I didn't have. I think it was the first time I was doing some tutorial, not the one Uri sent me, but the first time I ever looked at GraphQL, I couldn't figure out what fields were available. And the documentation explorer over on the right, where it says query and mutation, when I found that later, I was so excited because that's what told me what I was able to do. And I couldn't figure that out. So you just, show them that button because that's the button that I didn't find. That needs to have like a big red arrow. Bonnie, click here.
Yeah. Okay. So this docs thing is pretty cool. With most server libraries, there's built-in options for specifying kind of like documentation strings, which end up being shown in your graphical interface, which is really convenient. So here you'll see your root types, which are in this case I have query and mutation. You also might have a subscription type here if you have any subscriptions in your app, but in this case, this application doesn't, at least not yet.
And I could be wrong, but I think, Uri, correct me if I'm wrong, but that actually comes automatically out of your GraphQL definitions, and you don't even have to do anything. It just appears.
Yes, it's just you just write the schema and you get all of that for free being generated.
Yeah,
like there's many stuff just because of the schema is static. You can generate like endless amounts of stuff, and this is like one of them.
Yeah. So
when you're using GraphQL, you get this graphical interface that Ed's showing you without doing anything else. Like this already just comes. It's like literally one line of code in the server that says launch graphical at this port.
In some cases, like in the GraphQL Go package, if you're using Golang, it's just turned on by default, which is pretty nice.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go through a little bit of using this. On the left here, you have your query space. On the right, you have kind of your documentation area. And then down here at the bottom, you don't want to miss this, but you have a section for query variables. And then we'll get to this later, but the syntax in this area is going to be JSON. So over here, you can see we have a simple kind of hello world field here, which just to show you how you get a single field. You type it in there, and you can see you have IntelliSense over here, which is very nice. And then you'll see you get a data object with our hello field, which corresponds to your query key name. And this just returns a static world just for testing. But we'll go on to something a little bit more useful.
Hey, Ed, can I get you to bump the font size up just slightly for us old people?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. That's great.
All right. Okay. So before, we just had a hello in here, and you can see it returns that data. I'm actually going to switch over to the app here to show you kind of what it is that we're getting first. So this is my backend jobs kind of like admin interface. You can see we have a whole bunch of jobs here, and they have different statuses that they're in. Basically, they change between scheduled and running, and then either an error or a success or a failure state. And then up here, we have a data source object, which basically maps to what backend database it's going to be pulling its jobs data from. And you can see here we have a couple different databases. We have a Slabshot one, which is for my wood slabs project. And we also have a Freight Chick production one, which is for our primary shipping app. And then you can add data sources, and this uses mutation. Anyways, to list all of our jobs in the app, we need to get a list of data sources. So over here, you can see there's a get data sources method, which returns a list of data source. And so we're going to say that we want the ID of our data source, since we need that to list our jobs. And over here, we get a list of data source IDs. Now, that might be useful for just programmers, but when we're debugging stuff, we might also want to see the names of these so that we can correspond them to our interface and actually know where we're pulling data from. So I'm going to say I want to pull data from our Freight Chick production instances. And to do that, we are going to add another call here to get jobs, which takes a data source, and we're just going to pass in our data source ID statically here. And then it returns a list of jobs, and these jobs have many fields. So I'm just going to add a couple to show you how this works.
I'm noticing that the lack of commas is intentional then, huh?
Yes, there are no commas in your GraphQL schemas or your queries.
Okay.
Yeah, its syntax is kind of similar to JSON or JavaScript, but not really. Basically, it's a lot of curly braces and names, and then you can have kind of like name colon value type thing. And then, like, say you wanted to put a number here, you just put your number. Strings go in quotes. Yeah. But anyways, so we get our list of jobs, and you can see it return both our list of data sources and our jobs now. Let's say we want to make this a little bit more dynamic, and we want to get our data source from a variable. We can go up here, And if we add a little bit more info, we can define a data source variable here, and we can say it's a, we'll have to correspond the typings to what this get jobs request takes, which is a BSON object ID. This is very similar to the standard built-in ID field. It's just in my case, I'm dealing with a MongoDB database, and it was easier for me to add a new type that handles serializing and deserializing MongoDB's native data type. So now we can reference this data source variable up here. And if we add in some query variables down here, which, as I said before, uses the JSON syntax, you can see that we now, our type info is wrong here.
You guys correct me if I'm wrong, but in my experience with GraphQL, it's very strict about the types of your variables. And if you want to use a type of any, you can't, it's not going to happen. You need to declare your types.
Okay, so we get our type info working, and you can see that we're now taking a data source variable here, and we're passing it down into our get jobs call as a parameter for the data source. And then just to kind of demonstrate that these $sign variables can be called anything, and that is controlled on the client side, I'm just going to change that there. But so this data source parameter is, you can see that the get jobs, it has a hard-coded data source parameter. You can't change that because that's defined in your GraphQL schema on the server. But these client-side variables, you can call whatever you want. You can change them in your app at any point without updating your backend. You can call it foo in one app and bar in another. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
So what you're doing is giving it the name of your variable. So, and I think you can pass in more than one variable.
Yeah. So say we also want to have like a page number. We can also pass in like my page number. And we can just define another variable up here called $sign my page number. And if we had a if we had a corresponding variable down here, we can set that, and it should.
See what happens when you live code and you live stream at the same time.
Oh, int.
Ding.
Oh. But anyway,
I like that little noise. Where did that come from? That was perfect.
comes from my messaging app. I showed
That was adorable.
Yeah, but anyway, so you can have multiple variables. You can have multiple arguments for your methods here. You can hard code these things if you want. But it's kind of verbose in that it complains if you don't use stuff. But anyways, you can hard code stuff if you need to. It's pretty flexible here. But this is a great tool. I didn't find out about this until I was like 75% done building my GraphQL API, which I really wish I found out about it sooner because it's really nice when you're just kind of mocking up your API and playing with different fields and stuff. You don't have to wait for your Angular front end to compile.
I'm really sorry, Ed. That was my shortfall. I should have made sure and pointed that out.
What did you say?
I said I'm really sorry. I didn't point that out when I first told you about it. Yeah, and I actually like GraphQL because I'll go back, like once I started using it, I was excited, right? The first time I did my Hello World on GraphQL and got it working, that's where but once I actually started using it in real life in an actual app, sometimes, you know, the app started to get a little bit complex, and sometimes I'm getting an error, I'm not getting what I'm looking for. And so this was a really good way for me to go away from my UI and go back to GraphQL and check to make sure that my query was even working to begin with. And usually if I was debugging, it was much simpler than what I thought it was. If I go back to GraphQL and confirm that this is right, then I go back to the UI and figure out what my problem is over there.
Yeah, so that's kind of a short tutorial on how to use GraphQL. It comes with a lot of your standard backend servers. I'm not sure about how you get this on Apollo. I believe it's a package, or it might be a config parameter. It does.
You have the Chrome DevTools, so you can basically run even if you don't have it running on your server, for example, then there's the Apollo DevTools Chrome extension, and then you just, it's kind of like Batarang or all. You just, open DevTools, and then underneath you have this whole graphical thing that runs on your Apollo client on your store. So, and you can also see like your store state and everything. So it's actually, you can look at it as kind of like graphical plus Redux DevTools all together in a way.
Even better.
It's very comfortable.
I saw Bill's eyebrows go together like that. Bill, you didn't know about that?
I heard of it today. I didn't know what it did yet.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the thing Uri was just talking about, but I will definitely be using it now. I did have a question, though, along these lines. One of the things that we found really useful in other environments is tools like Postman, where you can have a whole catalog or catalog of catalogs of different queries that you can use. It's kind of like graphical, but for REST APIs, and has a lot of really nice extra utilities and niceties to make exploring APIs and working with APIs really helpful. Are there tools like that that kind of build on the idea of graphical, but go further?
Like to store all your queries?
I mean, they have a history section over here, but I've used Postman before, and it's kind of a little bit more built out, but they're also kind of more like a servicey type thing.
Right. I'm using Postman as an example. I know there are lots of tools kind of like that. Like I said, a catalog of queries, a way of grouping them together. And it's really great for being able to hand to a developer or to a team and say, here is the API for a service, and here are examples, dozens of them sometimes, of how to actually use it.
I did that. I have a good answer for that, and Denny can attest to this because I was working on a project with Keith Stewart, and I was doing GraphQL, and I made inside the shared folder, I made a constants, or I made a GraphQL, basically a GQL folder, and I put I just put them in there as like export const strings, and actually so while I was building the API, while I was doing the server side, and even when I started on the client side, I would go into graphical and get the query exactly the way that I wanted it to show up on the page, and then I would stash that string, that template string, in the shared folder, and then I had all of these files. And so when I pulled it into my component, it was just one line, and I could just go, shoot this query, because some of my queries had a lot of parameters and a lot of attributes in there, so they got kind of long, and I wanted to keep my components really nice and neat. So that was really cool. And then when I passed the project along to Keith and went to work on a different project, or Denny, and I went to work on a different project, then Denny was able to just pull up those files and look in there and see exactly how that was structured, which especially was helpful for the variables.
Yeah, also I think, like Ed mentioned, you have history and you can bookmark them, I think.
Yes,
it's not in that version, but it's like...
If you copy the URL, it copies everything in this.
Yeah, also I think in the history tab itself, but maybe it's like there's, I don't know.
Yeah, the history seems to persist.
Yeah, but then also, so GraphQL is open source, and people contributed and like improve it all the time. And also there's, I think GraphQL, they created like their own version of that, which has like plenty more features. And it's also designed nicer, like in a dark mode. And so, yeah, you can also just replace GraphQL with the GraphQL's GraphQL, which I don't know. I think it's called GraphQL Playground or something like that.
I loved that. When I was learning GraphQL, to me, GraphQL was like the Firebase of GraphQL, because it does have a really, really, really nice interface, and it's beautiful, and it interacts so well. And it takes away all the complexity of setting up your own server and everything. The only drawback is you have to pay, just like Firebase, but they have a beautiful interface and beautiful docs, and really helped me. I like it a lot.
Yeah, and since then they changed a bit. So now they also like open sourced a lot of their stuff, even I think most of their stuff. And they change into a model where it's basically something that's called Prisma, which is a database that the API of the database is GraphQL, and it's cool. And you can just run it locally, and it's completely open source, or you can use their service in order to host that database. So instead of building the whole server for you, they give you the database, and then you can build a server on top of it.
So you can use the GraphQL software without subscribing, like having a monthly subscription.
Yeah, now it's open
unless you're
source.
doing the cloud. See, I did not know that. It's a good thing.
They knew, they changed like their stuff. They decided to be nice.
And I'm sorry, we're so talkative tonight.
You're good. I just want to say too, in my experience about the Postman thing, I've dealt with a lot of REST APIs and SOAP APIs too, and besides for the being able to store examples easily, which kind of gives you in GraphQL, just exploring the GraphQL API has been a lot easier than exploring REST APIs. Like you can just kind of go in there, especially if people set up the documentation, which I kind of halfway have here because I didn't discover that it wound up in here until near the end of my project, and this was just internal. But really, it's very easy to just throw stuff in here with the IntelliSense, and you can kind of explore pretty easily an API.
Yeah, I'm definitely not drawing any equivalence between the ease of using a REST API versus the ease of using GraphQL. I definitely think GraphQL wins there. I was just curious about the ecology of the tools that are out there. Along the same lines, another question. Since we're all living in Angular, therefore we're living in TypeScript, and in TypeScript we've often got these gigantic schemas that already describe our object hierarchies. What are the recommended tools for moving back and forth between a GraphQL schema and like a TypeScript definition of a set of objects? I don't want to keep two things. I want one thing and I want the other one to be generated from it, or even better, not have to generate anything from it. It just happens automatically.
There's Uri made me aware of a tool yesterday or a couple of days ago that lets you do code gen for basically any language, but there's TypeScript support built in so that you can take your GraphQL schema files and automatically generate TypeScript schema files just as part of the build process, which once you set that up, it's pretty much one and done.
Or you just put a link in,
exactly. It's like if some of you used to work with or know Swagger and the Swagger CodeGen, the philosophy is the same. Like it takes the GraphQL typings and then you pass a template to it, which you can customize. And then it spits out whatever the template is. So you have TypeScript, Flow, you can do Java, .NET, like whatever you want. You can do backend code with directives. You can do front-end code. I've done like a few months ago, I've done a talk, like a lightning talk in Bratislava, where I showed like that I read the schema, but then I also add annotations. Like decorators on the schema that describes relations, like one-to-one, many-to-many, and then it actually generates an ORM, which generates my whole backend just from writing the schema. Wow. So that's one example. Another example that we've done was we generated like a complete admin panel just from the schema, like just from the schema and the relations. So it's not good for like really magnificent UI, but it's enough for like an admin panel. So with this thing, you can generate anything you want, and you can also customize it. Like most companies, they might have their own templates and stuff like that. That's why we thought about doing something that is more similar to the Swagger CodeGen, which like you can take the template and then edit it a bit because you want it a bit different or something like that.
Thanks. Okay. Perfect. So that kind of covers graphical and what you can do with it. So back to the slides. So this is just kind of backup pictures in case the demo gods don't like me. But our last section is about security. Basically, if you're moving a GraphQL server to production, or even if it's internal on a larger network, you probably want to take a look into this before you flip the switch over to your new server or set up your new server by itself. So the main risk for GraphQL servers is denial of service attacks. Denial of service attack is when you have evil users who are trying to basically take your server down so other people can't use it. This can create big issues if your business has to have strict uptime requirements, or generally if people just want to use your app. This might not be your nefarious competitor that's trying to take out your business, who's trying to prove you unreliable and gain an edge over you. It could just be an automated attack that's just generally some kid trying to wreak havoc on the internet. So probably want to set up a couple of these just because. Here's a couple of the common strategies. There's whitelisting known queries, calculating the cost of a query. You can set up query depth limits, and there's also query timeouts. We'll dive deep into each one of these. So the first and most ruthless option that we have on our list is whitelisting known queries. This means that you only allow queries which your own developers have sanctioned as good. In practice, this means gathering up all of the queries that your app uses and creating a list of those queries and calling them known queries, and then only allowing these queries on your backend. So basically, if somebody makes a query with different fields or that's in any way different from your known query list, you just deny the request. Some of the benefits of query whitelisting are that it's pretty easy to set up and doesn't really require a lot of maintenance if you add it into your build scripts. It also uses the developer as a gatekeeper to prevent bad queries from happening. So unless you have insurgents within your organization, you should be able to slip pretty easily at night. Generally, it's a great option if your app is public, but your API is not, or at least not yet. The main problem with query whitelisting is managing updates before deployments. You now have to keep track of old allowed queries if anyone is using an old version of your app, or if your app updates aren't instantaneous, which in many cases they aren't. You also lose one of the main benefits of GraphQL, which is that you get an easy-to-use public API, which is likely documented for free. If you lock down your queries to a small list that only your app uses, then it's going to be hard for anyone else to use your GraphQL server to build anything besides a clone of your current front end. Our next strategy is a little more advanced. It's calculating the cost of queries. This might sound complicated, but with the help of solid libraries, it is more of a tuning and management task than anything else. To start with, you have to add annotations to each of your resolver functions, basically specifying a cost factor, which is just a number. And then to calculate the cost of a query, you would add up all of these cost factors for all the resolvers that are called in a given query. Finally, you configure a maximum cost factor, either per app or per account. And if any query exceeds this, you return an error instead of attempting to execute it and taking up server resources. Calculating query cost is very effective against many denial of service attacks if your cost factors are in check. This can handle any type of query and is relatively easy to set up if you're using Node.js, but it might be a little more of a pain depending on if you're using different server languages that don't have library support or aren't easily changeable to get the information you need to do something like this. The real pain with this method is figuring out a good cost factor for your queries. It's also potentially hard to implement depending on the backend language, like I said. But for the cost factor issue, I'd recommend setting up solid logging for all of your current queries, running through your app a bit with some production data, and this can help you adjust the cost factors on each of your resolvers and also your maximum cost factor. Be aware that if you're too strict with these limits, you can prevent legitimate users from using your API just in the same way that you do with whitelisting queries. But if you have generous queries and an active support channel to change them if they are wrong, then you can avoid a lot of these downsides. Our next option is query depth limits. If your schema happens to allow nested queries, such as two objects referencing each other, then you'll probably want to set up query depth limits. It's also so easy to set up, you probably want to turn it on just in case. So say you have a book which has an author field and an author which has a book field. An attacker could use this to create an infinitely deep nested query which keeps referencing each other, and this could kill your server by eating memory and CPU cycles. So in this example, we have the book, which has authors and a name, and then in our evil query, somebody is requesting a book and the authors, and then the books for that author, for each of those authors, and then you just keep looping over this, and very quickly you can take up a lot of resources and destroy a server. Our next option, or actually, let me go back to that. So basically, to prevent this, you install a library or set up some code to check the depth on this, and you just set it to a limit. What you're going to do is you're going to go on your app and you're going to see, okay, my app uses a maximum depth of, say, 10, and then maybe just double that or configure it to some reasonable number, like maybe 20 or 30, that any sane query would use, and boom, you don't have to worry about this anymore. Life is good. So yeah, so with the query depth limits, they're easy to implement. There's a library for Node that sets this up for you. Just install that and you configure your number. You can probably set it off to 10 or 20 and not really have to worry about it. Our last option is just setting query timeouts. What this means is that you're just going to abort the query if it takes too long. This can help kill attacks before they get too bad, but really if you just do this, you're not going to be protecting from all that much. This is just similar to timing out on a REST API call. It's more so to protect you from your own bad code than anything else, so that something doesn't continue to run forever or potentially many minutes. But how you want to do this on a GraphQL server is you would just set a basic timeout on your GraphQL endpoint. And then that could get a little bit more advanced depending on what kind of transport you're using. Like if you're using a WebSocket, you're probably going to have to tie that more into connection life cycles. But if you're just using the standard HTTP transport, then it's very easy to turn on. You can just set it to however many seconds or potentially minutes you would like a query to optionally run. If you're not using the WebSocket transport, then your only other potential issue with this would be if you're using subscriptions, since actually, I don't know, that wouldn't affect you unless you're using the WebSocket. Uri, you might be able to confirm this. Do subscriptions, they keep creating multiple requests, or they do like a long polling type of setup?
Depends on your transport. Subscriptions is basically an abstraction of like whatever protocol you choose.
So depending on your transport, you may or may not be able to turn this on. But either way, this is kind of like a last case defense that probably isn't going to save you all that much, or at least not from a determined attacker. So finally, we have some useful links that you'll probably want to check out. If you go to this link down here, that'll take you to these slides so you can actually get to these links since they're very long. I just made them clickable. But first off, we have a WhatsApp clone, which is built with GraphQL and Angular and Postgres. Uri made this, and it's very, very in-depth. And it's a great reference, and I'd highly recommend going through it if you're new to GraphQL and you kind of want to get your feet wet. Next up, we have an article on securing your GraphQL API, which kind of goes more in depth and suggests more of the node packages you can use to implement all the previous security options that I spoke of. Next up, we have a GraphQL code generator, which is what we were previously talking about to generate TypeScript typings or other language type files or docs or what have you based on your GraphQL schema. And then last, we have a talk by Bonnie and Sam at Angular Mix about GraphQL, which we have a video, it was filmed on a cell phone, so it's kind of shoddy. But
yeah, it was tragic.
It's worth a watch, and then definitely check out the GitHub repo with their code for that, as it serves as a great short demo for a lot of the features you use in GraphQL. And then thank you, everyone, for help with the slides and encouragement, and thank you, Bonnie, for pushing me to do this, and everyone for attending and all of our panelists.
Thank you, Ed.
And I think we have time for Q&A.
We do. Turn your screen share off and let us see you, because I have to tell you, Really, I didn't say when I introduced you that this was your first time doing a presentation because I didn't want to jinx you, or at least I don't think I didn't mean to, wasn't planning to, but I really have to say you were awesome. That was such a good talk, and that was your first talk, and you did awesome. And I learned GraphQL last year, and I've been doing it for a while, and I've actually been, building it and using it in production in actual, projects. And I learned some things tonight that I did not know before. So you did a really good job. You're a natural.
Thank you, guys. I couldn't do it without you. I had so much help.
Now you have to start submitting talks. That's the next required step for you. Is you need to do some CFPs, because now you've got your feet wet, and you did a great job.
Thanks.
You guys have any questions, comments? I'm checking the YouTube. If you guys on YouTube have any questions, speak now, forever hold your peace.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. So I've been using GraphQL a little bit, and I know about the query and the mutation, but I have to say the subscription was kind of new to me. So can you review that again? What's the difference between the subscription and, let's say, the query? And does a subscription have any relevance to a mutation? Or is it just a different type of query?
So subscription is basically a different type of query. If you're familiar with your front end, I would say think of a query as a promise, even though it technically returns an observable. It's just involving or returning one piece of data. Whereas a subscription is going to optionally give you multiple pieces of changes over time. And then really the key factor with this is that you don't want to push all your data through a subscription. You want to pull your initial data with a query and then have a subscription that updates the small parts of that data that changes. Such as in our WhatsApp example, you might pull in a whole group message with all the members and all the metadata for a chat group via a query, and then you would have a subscription that you would subscribe to get the latest messages in that chat group.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
And then I'm pretty sure on this, but I don't believe that a subscription has anything to do with a mutation, or at least not that I've seen so far.
Here's the way I always explain it, and this is actually something that once I got it in my brain, I was really excited and I totally nerded out over it. Because remember when I was saying at the very beginning how I learned RxJS and I learned about the observables, and I was really excited, and I was like, these observables are so cool, right? Because that real-time updates, I want, like, rather than querying and sending out to request my data, I want it to tell me when there's something new, right? And I got that functionality very easily with Firebase, but I really struggled with how to get that functionality out of my old. And at one point, I actually remember I went to Uri and I was trying to get the project manager of the project that I was working on to switch all the data over to a cloud service, because I wanted the push notifications like Firebase does, and I didn't know how to do that. And like I said, now I know there are several options, Socket.io and things like that. You can do that with PubSub, but that's what I was trying to capture. And being a front-end developer, I really was struggling with that. And so subscriptions is exactly that. If you have this old dusty, SQL database or some 2003 technology, Microsoft Access or whatever it is, right? It could be some old thing, and you put that GraphQL middle layer, and it allows you to have that. Because what happens is you have your queries and you have your mutations. The mutation will push down to the server to update your database, and basically the subscription just kind of hides there and waits. And when that mutation comes in, it will get it, and it will notify all your other clients that so it'll do your subject next for you, which once I actually got that all working and got it in I was very excited, because then I can use my old database without going to the paid cloud subscription and still have that functionality and not have to, I felt like there's always like something new that you have to learn, right? But it was really, I wouldn't say it was easy, because I had to figure out, I was still learning NGRX, and so like the whole spread operator and Redux, and there was all kinds of stuff that was going on that I had to kind of level up a little bit. But once I got it all set up, it was beautiful, beautiful. And I only had to really go through the pain of learning it once, and then now I can use it anytime I want to. And it's like, I know how to do that. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Denny?
Yes, thank you.
Sometimes I take a really long time to answer a question, but in my mind, like, because I get excited, you guys.
I just want to say too, the hard part with subscriptions it's not so much using them, it's more so syncing your backend servers together and dealing with that extra subscription layer on your backend when you have multiple users or servers, and keeping those in sync.
Yeah, the first time is the hardest.
And then there's a lot of performance optimizations you can do with that too, but luckily you really won't need those unless you're doing large scale or if you care highly about uptime.
So Julio asked, without GraphQL, you can't do the same thing with subscriptions, Bonnie, and the answer is you can do that without GraphQL. I just didn't know how. I didn't know, like, you can set up like WebSocket. I think WebSockets, and there are other ways to do it to send out.
I'm proof that you can do it without WebSocket or without GraphQL. I have basically feature equivalent of Firebase for Freight set up, where it's very efficient, like Google Docs like synchronization, where it pushes between all of my servers in a peer-to-peer style. And there's a very similar subscription system that I built on top of WebSockets in there. But I'm actually going to create, my goal is to create a GraphQL wrapper around that service so that it's easy to use from a public API perspective, because the WebSocket protocol that I have is a little bit complex, or at least it would be complex to make various libraries for.
Yeah, but see, the trick is you're like wicked smart and you know how to do all this like crazy back-end stuff. And I was a front-end developer going, what's a WebSocket?
But it took me like 3 or 4 tries to get WebSockets working, like over like a year. So it was not an easy thing to build, but I needed it for, like, I built this really fancy report system that synchronizes like drag and drop, and like you pick all your graphs and styles and metrics and everything. And like I wanted that to synchronize between everyone.
Yeah, so it makes it pretty easy with GraphQL subscriptions. Once I got it working, it was pretty nice, and it's very quick and fast. And I think, excuse me, Uri, you could maybe remind us, because it's been a while since I've done this, but there are a couple of things that I learned along the way, and I think one of them was like in-memory cache, which there are little things that you can do that just make it super, super easy and super fast. There's like predictive when you're pushing something. I don't remember half of the stuff, but there were a couple of little things in Graph. Huh?
Optimistic UI for the mutations.
Yes. See, yes, it's a good thing you guys are here. Because
like
there are.
I implement those without GraphQL, and it's just a complete pain. It's a complete one-off. The Apollo client really makes that easy for you.
There were little things. Little things that it was just really there, like the in-memory cache and things like that, where Apollo GraphQL has something that you can set up once and it saves you. It just makes it's just so easy, because it's like little configurations and you put like one line of code in there and then it does all this stuff for you. And it's like, basically they did all our work for us. Yeah, it's like, a little complicated to understand it, but once you understand it, it's like you make this really cool stuff easy.
Yeah. Like I covered the basics in this talk, but with Apollo, there's a lot more like advanced options in Apollo that are like pretty easy to configure, and it really gives you a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll just add, first of all, on the subscriptions part. So subscriptions is basically PubSub.
Yeah.
But the interesting part is that, first of all, you get like you have a schema, and then the schema also describes basically which events you can subscribe to. So you know in advance from the schema what events can I subscribe to, and also you know what data you can get back. So unlike PubSub, where like it's just some random data or events flowing over to you, with GraphQL, basically what you're saying is, I want to subscribe to this event, and every time this event happens, I want to get this chunk of data. So you decide what data you get every time into your client every time the event happens. So that's like in my opinion, like a big benefit over other PubSub systems. Like you can use other PubSub systems underneath GraphQL subscriptions. It's just like a protocol on top, and it's just one protocol or way in GraphQL to achieve real time. Like there's 2 other ways, or 2 other popular way. One is just do polling on your query, and another one is called live query, where you put basically a live annotation on your query, and then which is more experimental, but yeah, you can actually do live queries. You can say this query, every time it updates, I want to just push me the updated information. So there's a lot of ways to do real-time with GraphQL. GraphQL subscriptions is like, I think, the most scalable and interesting part. I've made a talk about it, like just on how to do real-time with GraphQL. It's a very interesting subject. And I'll just add, but I wanted to add something important. GraphQL is great for being, for communicating between the client and the server. But the thing is that you don't really need GraphQL APIs in order to use GraphQL. Like, one of the things that you can do today is, let's say you have a REST API and you can't change that. You can basically use GraphQL just on your client side. And why would you want to do that? Is basically because Apollo client, if you describe your data in GraphQL, just your client-side data, the client-side store, for example, your ngRx. So your ngRx store doesn't care basically at runtime what is the structure of your data. But Apollo client, because of GraphQL, does care and does understand it in runtime. And that means that you can put the queries on the components, like the queries of the data, you put them on the components itself and not like in a central service. And that gives you a lot of benefits. I won't dive too much in here. There's a lot of talks about it, but what I would just say is that GraphQL gives you a lot of benefits, even if you just use it on your client. And you can use it just on your client and then call REST services to your backend like you used before. Yeah, so it's basically, you can look at it as kind of like a superstore or a super ngRx.
I actually
like
have
ngRx,
a funny story about this.
Much more. Yeah.
When I saw, it was last year, kind of late last year, I first got into ngRx when Thomas Burleson came here and with Dominic Elm for ThoughtRAM training in the summer. And I learned ngRx, and I had been wanting to learn ngRx for a while, but it's not, like, it's kind of advanced, right? So it took me a while to get it in my head and start using it. And I had implemented this state management in an app that I was building. And then I had a question about the store, because there's an Apollo store, and then there's also my store, right? And so I went to Uri and I was like, hey, how do I combine these two stores? Because I want to have my single source of truth. I have this whole state management ngRx thing that I just put in my app. And you know how you have like load my data and then load my data success. And so you get your ngRx actions, and you once load my data finishes and you actually get the result back from the server, then it's automatically going to trigger load my data success, which will load your DOM and all that kind of stuff, right? So I had all that stuff set up, and I was extremely proud of it because I got ngRx and it was very cool. I was very proud of myself. And so I went to Uri and I showed it to him, and he was like, well, you don't need all that. Like, Apollo will do all of that for you. And I was really, actually, I love you, Uri, but I was like frustrated. I was like, first of all, I just learned how to do that, and it's very cool. And second of all, I was really proud of that code because it took me a long time to get it all working and smooth, and it was really cool, right? And so I was like, what do you mean I don't need that? And Uri's like, well, you can have it if you want it, right? You can keep it. It's okay for you to do whatever you want to do with your app, but you just don't need it, because what he made me understand, and I was really frustrated at the time because I was like, I just finished writing all that really cool code, and Uri's like, you don't need it. But the point of what he was saying was, we will do all that for you, right? And like, because Apollo will go off to your server and it will bring you back this beautiful observable. So rather than setting up all this complicated stuff that says, let me know when the server has returned my stuff, you just, hook into that observable and it just cleans all that out for you. So what I actually ended up doing was I took all of the, specific query building stuff that I had in my client. I moved all that, because there's like logic. You have to like go and get this that goes with this when you're doing your queries out of the database. Sometimes that stuff gets complicated, right? So I took basically some of the stuff that I had in my state management, and the only thing I did was moved it to the server. And it wasn't technically ngRx at that time, but I was actually happy after Uri taught me all this. I was like, but I just learned this. But the good thing was the Redux, the resolvers, the spread operators, all that stuff that I had learned when I learned ngRx and the RxJS, that translated, because when I moved it to the server, it actually still, a lot of that code, the resolvers were still basically the same, right? It was the same code. it just was on the server. But yeah, I remember that day very well because I was really excited about ngRx, and Uri's like, I mean, you can have it, you just don't need it. And it actually, I refactored a lot, and Denny will know because it was the Transcripts project. I did a lot of refactoring, but once I moved it, I was actually very, very happy with it because my client was so clean and so nice. I had all the exact same functionality that I had before, but I had much less code. So it was frustrating, but it really turned out very, very well because when I finished that, it was beautiful. So thank you, Uri.
I'll just maybe summarize it in a short sentence, which means like it's important to know that one of the things that I see a lot in applications is that a lot of the front-end code basically is about getting a lot of like requests from the server, waiting for them. Then once you got all those requests, now you need to iterate or restructure them into the structure that you want your UI to be rendered, and then you push it to your UI components. The thing is that if you have your data structured, which we already do today because we use TypeScript anyway, so if you would write it instead of TypeScript, we will write it in GraphQL, and we would use it in runtime, then all of that code can be now automatically for us by a library. And that means that like really like 50% of the code that you write today in order to get data from the server, manipulate it, wait for all the requests and put it in the component, you just don't need to do. And again, it's not even related. It's not even related to the server because you can call REST endpoints. Like it can just be on your client. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we talked enough about it.
That I wanted to really echo what Uri was saying earlier about not having to have an entire GraphQL-based infrastructure on the back end before you can start taking advantage of this. And one of the early GraphQL projects I did, I didn't realize that it was Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital that said, you know, you can do all this cool GraphQL stuff before your client actually gets their stuff together on the back end. I'm like, tell me more about what you mean. And the entire resolver layer lived in the client. And as the client, as in the person that was paying us money, got more of their back end up and running to support GraphQL, we just shifted that stuff back to the server, but all of the web client side code actually stayed almost exactly the same. It let us get a lot of the advantages of GraphQL without having to wait on anybody to put in infrastructure to support it.
And you start moving more and more of your logic and your like the guts of your application to the server, which gives you which is what I learned a lot about when I was working with Lucas in London about the whole thin client presentation that we did. Was you really want that client, especially if you're doing mobile, you want that client to be as tiny and fast as possible. So it just takes so much of that complexity, the code that you've written. And I was not a backend developer, so for me to spin up, I was actually I have a really dorky tweet about that from last fall. I was like, I just made my first GraphQL server, and I ran to update my resume and put full stack on there because I was like, that's all right, I made a server. But the thing is, I didn't know a whole lot about that, backend technology, and I was still able to spin it up pretty quickly. And then once I got that running, which was just straight off the tutorial that Uri sent me, then I was able to take all the TypeScript stuff that I already knew and all basically the resolvers that I had already written. I just moved them to the server and made my client super fast. Yeah. Well, it's we passed the top of the hour, and I'm really glad that Uri's here. But I also know that Uri's on another continent, which means it's like the middle of the night for Uri. So we should probably wrap it up. This was super fun, guys, and I think we haven't covered GraphQL a whole lot on ngHouston. I have actually still found a lot of people and some of you guys that I was talking to in the last couple months that had not heard of GraphQL. So I really wanted to do an intro beginner. Ed, I think you did a great job, and I definitely think that you should come back and do more talks for ngHouston because you're awesome. And I really appreciate the panel and you guys. I think that we should have more GraphQL topics on ngHouston because I think a lot of people haven't heard of it yet, but I think they're going to love it because I love it. So yeah. Any parting thoughts for you guys?
Yay, Ed.
Yay, Ed. I like it. Ed, you were awesome. Thank you. All right, that's it for us tonight. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.